Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are digging into one of those crazy what-if stories from history that almost nobody in America knows about. We are talking about the end of World War II, the Allied occupation of Japan, and how one major Allied power ally, the Nationalist government of China, had a golden ticket to put boots on the ground in Japan and they completely fumbled it. Not because Japan said no, not because we blocked them, but because they just could not get out of their own way. So let's break this down step by step from where we sat as Americans watching this whole thing unfold. Now, this story actually starts way back in 1943. By then, even the Japanese high command knew they were cooked. The war in the Pacific was turning against them, and it was only a matter of time that year. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek met in Cairo to start sketching out the post-war world. Churchill did not even want China at the table. In his memoirs, he actually complained that Chinese issues were tedious and kept interrupting the real work of the US and British military chiefs. Classic British elitism, right? They still saw China as a backward secondary power, but Roosevelt, he saw it completely differently. He told Churchill straight up that China was vital not just for the war, but for the future stability of Asia. And he went even further. He proposed that China should take the leading role in the military occupation of Japan, not a supporting part, not a symbolic presence. The lead, that is how much faith FDR had in China's post-war status. He genuinely believed that a strong pro-American China would be the anchor of peace in the Pacific. So what did the nationalist government do? They said no thanks, their official response, and I am pulling this straight from the archives, was China is unable to bear this major responsibility. This matter can be decided later based on future developments. Basically, they punted, they had the world's most powerful leader vouching for them, and they kicked the can down the road. Can you imagine that? The President of the United States is offering you the leadership role in occupying Japan, and you say, well, think about it later. From our perspective, that was already a red flag. Fast forward to 1945. Japan surrenders, and now the Allies are finally putting together the actual occupation force. China, as one of the signatories to the surrender, is automatically part of the occupation. General Weimeyer, who was running the China theater for us, formally recommends that the Nationalists send 10 divisions and an Air Force mixed group to Japan. 10 divisions, that is a serious commitment, about 100,000 troops. But the Nationalists came back and said, 10 is too many. We will send 3 divisions, our Youth Corps. Now, on paper, that sounds fine. The Youth Corps was formed in September 1944, and they were mostly educated young men, college students and intellectuals, patriotic motivated. But here is the catch. They had never fought. Japan surrendered before they ever saw combat. They were basically raw recruits with no battlefield experience. So when MacArthur, our supreme commander in Japan, looked at that proposal, he said, absolutely not. This is about international prestige. You send your finest combat units or you do not bother coming at all. And honestly, from our perspective, that made perfect sense. We were putting our best troops there. And we expected the same from our allies. MacArthur was not going to let China send a bunch of kids to parade around while American and British soldiers did the real work. So who did the Americans consider their finest? The new First Army, those guys were legends. In Burma, they smashed the Japanese 18th Division. The so-called Kings of Jungle Warfare, they killed over 4,000 Japanese troops in the Mikaina campaign alone, and they forced a Japanese major general to commit suicide. That kind of reputation carries weight in military circles. They were battle-hardened, well equipped, and they had fought alongside our Merrill's Marauders. So when we said send your best, we meant them. The Nationalists could not really say no after that, so they agreed to send the new First Army. The plan was to sail from Hong Kong's Kowloon and land on Japanese soil no later than January 1946. Everything seemed set. The troops were ready, the ships were being arranged, and the world was watching. But then, right at that moment, everything went sideways. In November 1945, the Nationalists suddenly announced they were temporarily suspending the troop deployment. Why? Because they had shifted their focus to the Civil War with the Communists. And let me tell you, from the American perspective, that was a massive headache. Not because we were peace cynics, we were not. We had just come out of the biggest war in history. And we were already staring down the Soviet Union, but we wanted a stable, unified China that leaned toward us to act as a counterweight to the Soviets in the Pacific. A civil war would wreck that plan completely. We did not want China to become another divided battleground like Korea or Germany. So in December 1945, we sent General George Marshall Orr, Army Chief of Staff, no less the architect of our victory in Europe, over to China as a special envoy to mediate. He tried to get both sides to dial it back. He spent months shuttling between the nationalists and the communists, trying to broker a coalition government. Spoiler, he failed. But during the negotiations, tensions did cool off for a little while, and with things quieter, the occupation plan got dragged back onto the table on March 11, 1946. Marshall stopped in Japan on his way back to Washington for a debrief. He met with MacArthur in Tokyo, and they had a long conversation about Chinese troops in Japan. MacArthur said he would welcome them with open arms. He even told Marshall that having Chinese soldiers there would strengthen the legitimacy of the occupation in Asian eyes. So Marshall sent word back to the nationalists, get a press release out, announce that you are sending troops, and make damn sure you designate a division that is actually combat ready. The nationalists, once again, could not really refuse. So on March 19, 1946, they made it public, and back in China, people went nuts in a good way. Newspapers celebrated with banner headlines. Ordinary citizens felt like China was finally getting the respect it deserved after a century of humiliation. You could feel the pride through the pages. There were even parades in some cities, but here is the twist by then. The new First Army was already being redeployed to Manchuria to fight the communists, so they had to swap in another unit, the Honor 2nd Division of the 53rd Corps. Now, that division was no slouch. They were among the first Chinese units to be fully equipped with American weapons and trained by our advisors. They had American helmets, American rifles, American trucks. So the U.S. military gave them a thumbs up. Not as legendary as the new First Army, but good enough for occupation duty. They looked the part, and that mattered. Next came the location. On April 26, 1946, the Chinese delegation chief, Zhu Shiming, met with MacArthur to hammer out where their troops would be based. MacArthur gave them two options, Niigata on the west coast or Nagoya in central Japan. They picked Nagoya, which was one of Japan's 6 largest cities before the war, a major industrial and cultural hub. That was a huge symbolic win. Putting Chinese troops right in the heart of Japan sent a powerful message. And then in June 1946, the Chinese Occupation Advance Unit actually raised their national flag over the Nagoya occupation zone. And I have to tell you, as an American looking at that moment, it felt like a genuine victory for them, the first time in modern history that Chinese troops were standing on Japanese soil as conquerors. That was real. That flag meant something. Now came the hard part, troop preparation. The nationalists knew they had to look sharp. All weapons were swapped out for American-made gear. Any soldier who was too short, too old, or too ugly, I am not joking, was eliminated. The height requirement was at least 5'7", which was actually taller than the average Chinese man at the time. They had to have decent facial features because they were going to be representing their country in public education. At least elementary school, which back then was actually a decent standard. Most people in China were still illiterate. Officers had to speak English, eat with a fork and knife, and even dance Western-style ballroom dances because they would be interacting with us and other Allied officers at social events. They were basically being trained to be diplomats in uniform. Morale was through the roof. There is a recorded quote from one soldier saying, "We are training on the South China coast, but our hearts are already racing toward Japan." They were ready to go. You could feel the anticipation in the ranks. And how did the advance team get there? Not on some passenger transport. They flew in B-24 bombers on May 27, 1946. The advance party took off from China in American-made bombers and landed in Japan. When reporters asked why bombers, the delegation chief said, "We are flying in as an armed force. This is to demonstrate that we are victors." From our standpoint, that was a brilliant piece of theater. It sent a message not just to Japan, but to the entire world China had won, and they were coming as conquerors, not as beggars. That was the kind of symbolism that resonated in the press back home too. Once they were on the ground, the advance team had two main jobs. First, coordinate the logistics with the U.S. military. They had to work out where the troops would live, how they would train, what their rules of engagement would be. Second, settle some old scores from history. You have to remember the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, the first Sino-Japanese War. Back then, the Japanese captured 2 Chinese ironclads. The Jinyuan and the Jingyuan, and later displayed their anchors in Tokyo's Ueno Park as war trophies. For decades, that was a national humiliation, a constant reminder of China's weakness. So the Chinese delegation made it a point to demand those anchors back. After tough negotiations with the Japanese authorities and MacArthur's staff in May 1947, they finally succeeded. Those anchors are now in the Beijing Military Museum, by the way. That was a big deal emotionally for the Chinese people. So at this point, everything seemed ready. The troops were training. The advance team was in Japan. The flag was flying. The old humiliations were being undone. There was just one missing piece: logistics. And this is where it all fell apart. Under the Allied occupation rules, each participating country had to supply its own troops with food, ammunition, fuel, and all other necessities. The U.S. could provide assistance if needed, but there was a strict ban on buying or seizing supplies locally in Japan. Why? Because Japan was in the middle of a massive famine. In May 1946, there were actual food riots in Tokyo and other cities. With hungry mobs storming warehouses, Japanese civilians were literally starving. There was no surplus to feed foreign troops. That rule applied to everyone equally: the British, the Australians, the Chinese, everyone. So it was not discriminatory. But for China, it was a killer because they simply did not have the sea lift capacity to move that much tonnage across the Pacific. They had no experience with large-scale overseas logistics. Their merchant marine was tiny, and most of their ships had been sunk during the war. So they came to us for help. At first, the U.S. was willing to lend a hand. We were the ones who had invited them, after all, and we wanted them to succeed. But then, the British and other allies started complaining. They said, "Hold on, you are telling us to be self-sufficient, but you are giving China a free pass. That is a double standard," and they were not wrong. The British were paying for their own troops out of a shattered post-war economy, and they resented any perceived favoritism. So the U.S. military took a step back and reassessed. They concluded that China theoretically had the capacity to solve its own logistics. They just did not want to spend the money or effort, and were hoping for American handouts. That was the perception in Washington, that the nationalists were not serious about this. They were just looking for a free ride. So on July 9th, 1946, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff tightened the policy. They did not cut China off completely, but they said, "Fine, fill out the forms for what you need. We will review it case by case." And when the forms came in, our officers were stunned. The nationalists had only requested supplies for 3 months' food, fuel, ammunition. And then they expected the U.S. to foot the bill for decades of occupation. Decades. They wanted us to bankroll their entire presence in Japan indefinitely, with no plan for how they would eventually take over the cost themselves. The U.S. said, "That is not going to fly. We can provide the material, but you have to pay for it." It would run about $5 million per quarter. That was the price tag, roughly $550 million in today's money. So the Nationalist Foreign Ministry went to their finance ministry and asked for the money. The finance ministry said, "We are broke. Our treasury is empty because of the Civil War. Maybe borrow $5 million from the Americans and pay them back later." The foreign ministry said that would be absurd. Borrowing money to pay for something the Americans were already providing, it made no sense. So they cabled Washington with a single line: "Our occupation force is temporarily postponed. Supply issues remain unresolved." Now, let's be real here. Was supplying one division really that impossible? No, absolutely not. The real reason was that the Civil War was already in full swing. The nationalists were throwing every available unit into Manchuria, into Shandong, into northern China. They were losing ground to the communists, and they needed every rifle and every soldier at home, that shiny occupation force. The Honor 2nd Division never set foot on a ship to Japan. They got redirected to fight in Jiangsu province instead, where they were eventually destroyed by communist forces. So the whole thing was a convenient excuse. They never really intended to go, not if it cost them anything. But we in the U.S. did not give up yet. In January 1947, MacArthur came up with another idea. He said, "Okay, if you cannot send an army division, how about a naval contingent? Just 2 ships, 200 sailors that you can supply easily." That was a much smaller commitment, and it would still give China a visible presence in the occupation. The nationalists thought that made sense. They picked the destroyer Taikang, a modern American-built vessel, and scheduled its departure for March 8, 1947. But then, in February 1947, the February 28th incident broke out in Taiwan, a major uprising against nationalist rule sparked by brutal repression and cultural tensions. And the Taikang was rerouted there to suppress it. After that got handled, the ship was sent up to Dalian to secure the port in the Northeast from Soviet influence. It kept bouncing around from crisis to crisis, and Japan never happened. The Navy plan died too, just like the Army plan. So Army canceled, Navy canceled. But here's where I said earlier that they did actually set foot in Japan, because throughout this whole period, the nationalists maintained a diplomatic delegation in Tokyo, just a political office. No military authority, no troops. They could not do anything substantive. They attended meetings, they filed reports. But they had no muscle to back up their voice. Finally, in February 1948, they scraped together 40 military police officers from their military police units, just 40 guys, and sent them to Japan to perform ceremonial and liaison duties. That was it. 40 men. They guarded the delegation office. They marched in a few parades. And they went home a few years later. That was the entire Chinese occupation force in the end. After all that talk, all that planning, all that global prestige at stake, they ended up with 40 MPs. 40, so let's be absolutely clear from an American perspective, this was not Japan saying no, this was not the US blocking them, this was not a lack of international legitimacy. China was invited. Roosevelt himself had championed them at Cairo. MacArthur welcomed them repeatedly. We offered logistical support at a cost. Yes, but that cost was not unreasonable by any standard. $5 million a quarter was a fraction of what we were spending on the occupation ourselves. But the nationalist government was so consumed by the Civil War, so focused on short-term military gains at home, that they squandered a historic opportunity to project power on the world stage. They could have had permanent prestige, a seat at the table in occupied Japan, a tangible symbol of their victory over Japan, and a voice in the post-war Pacific order. Instead, they sent 40 cops. It was a catastrophic failure of strategic vision. Think about the implications. If they had followed through, Chinese troops would have been in Japan alongside Americans, British, and Australians for years. That would have changed the dynamics of the Cold War in Asia. It would have given the nationalist government a legitimacy boost at home and abroad. It might have even affected how the Civil War played out, because they would have had a battle-hardened occupation force to recall if needed. But they blew it. They chose short-term gains over long-term influence. And that, my friends, is a classic case of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think they made the right call focusing on the Civil War, or was this a catastrophic missed opportunity? Could China have been a real player in post-war Japan if they had just paid the bill? Drop your take in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell because we have plenty more forgotten history to dig into. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.